The next item of business is a statement by Angela Constance on implementation of the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act 2021. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Angela Constance. Up to 10 minutes, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to provide Parliament with an update on the 2021 Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act. After the commentary we have seen since the Act's commencement on 1st of April, much of it misleading at best, I will take this opportunity to remind members of its purpose. Let me begin by emphasising that in Scotland we should be rightly proud of our history as a welcoming nation and one that celebrates and values diversity in our communities. However, we must be vigilant in protecting those values, challenge those who deny them, and recognise there are people who experience hatred and prejudice every day, and we cannot and must not be complacent. We should remember that when we talk about hate crime, we are describing behaviour which is both criminal and rooted in prejudice, where the offender's actions have been driven by hatred towards a particular group, hatred for people just on the basis of who they are. Police Scotland describe hate crimes as offences which include, but are not limited to, assault, verbal abuse, damage to property, threatening behaviour, robbery and harassment. And it can take place anywhere, including online. What the Hate Crime Act does is maintain and consolidate existing legislative protections against offences aggravated by prejudice against the following 5 characteristics: disability, race, religion, sexual orientation and transgender identity. These are the same characteristics that are protected under hate crime legislation in England and Wales. The Act also, for the first time, includes age as a new statutory aggravation. And last week I visited Age Scotland and met with the Scottish Ethnic Minority Older People's Forum, who were generous in sharing their experiences and why the Act is important to them. Catherine Crawford, Age Scotland's Chief Executive Officer, stated, "It is really important to see age included for the first time, as we will get a much better picture of how this features in criminal acts and how it cuts across other protected characteristics. We hope that the new laws will empower older people to report hate crimes." The Hate Crime Act introduces new offences for threatening and or abusive behaviour and the communication of threatening or abusive material, which is intended to stir up hatred against a group of people who possess or appear to possess the particular characteristics I have outlined. This could take many forms, including pictures, videos or information posted on websites.
Maggie Chapman, to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. In the first week since this Act's implementation, Police Scotland indicated that only 3.8% of the allegations received were authentic. 240 were logged as hate crimes and 30 as non-hate crimes. Does the Cabinet Secretary believe those numbers were due to the widespread misinformation spread about the Act, including from members in this chamber? And does she agree that this misinformation serves to damage the victims and survivors this Parliament should be supporting?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I strongly believe that the information that has been published by Police Scotland with respect to the calls that they have received in the first few weeks of the implementation of the Act is significantly important information. There is no doubt that Police Scotland received a high volume of online hate crime reports, but we should all be encouraged that we have seen a nearly 75% decrease in the past week, with calls falling from in excess of 7,000 to in excess of 1,800. And we are, I believe, moving in the right direction, where police are receiving less calls. But I do think the member's point that despite a high volume of anonymous online reports, that at the end of the day, the number of recorded crimes is comparatively small. And that both demonstrates the need for this Act, that there's been 445 recorded crimes in the past fortnight, and it should increase confidence in policing in this country that they are acting proportionately and accordingly in the manner that the law intended.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement. Police Scotland has been bombarded with almost 9,000 reports because of Humza Yousaf's hate crime law, a law that threatens free speech and a law that is critically different to competent legislation elsewhere in the UK, despite the SNP's spin that we've just heard. Yep. The vast majority of these 9,000 reports are not crimes. Despite the SNP's best efforts, Scotland is not suffering from a hate epidemic. It's suffering from bad SNP legislation. Yep. And the Cabinet Secretary talks about misinformation. What an absolute brass neck. The misinformation has come from her government, including Humza Yousaf and the Community Safety Minister. They misquote their own legislation, confusing the public and fuelling even more complaints to police. And police officers are paying the price for this absolute shambles. As a new HMICS report confirms, they already feel unsafe and unable to do their jobs. Yet the SNP is now ordering these exhausted police officers to police our speech. The government was repeatedly warned that their law was unworkable and would be weaponised. They didn't listen to us. They didn't listen to anyone else. Neither did Labour nor the Lib Dems. So will they now listen, admit that they got it wrong and back our demand to scrap Humza Yousaf's hate crime law?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, bearing in mind we want to have a debate that's rooted in facts and respect, may I respectfully remind Mr Finlay that it is this Parliament's hate crime legislation. It's this Parliament, 82 members in this Parliament, voted to modernise and update our laws to protect those at the sharp end, day in, day out, of hate crime in this country. And I, for one, will not turn a blind eye to hate crime or to the victims that suffer at the hands of those who perpetrate hate. Now, I'm very clear, Presiding Officer, about my own responsibilities, and I do wonder if all members reflect strongly on their responsibilities, because in this Parliament we should be united on two things, irrespective of our views on any piece of legislation. Firstly, we should be united on the evils of hate crime and the corrosive effect it has on individuals, families and communities the length and breadth of Scotland. And secondly, we should be united and on the same script, Mr Finlay, in strongly calling and in discouraging people from wasting police time. And it is not acceptable for members of the Conservative Party to be democracy deniers. This legislation was subject to very careful scrutiny indeed, and some excellent cross-party working, some of which his own members contributed to make an act that was strong, that was defensible, compliant with the European Convention of Human Rights, and most of all protects victims of hate crimes whilst also protecting the rights of freedom of expression.
I call Liam MacArthur to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of her statement and welcome, I think, the acknowledgement that preparation for the implementation of this law has fallen short and I think has contributed to some extent in some of the confusion we've seen about what this Act does and, importantly, what it does not do. A gap in the protections, of course, is a standalone misogyny offence, which the Scottish Government promised on the back of Baroness Kennedy's report 2 years ago. Given the importance of that gap being filled, will the Cabinet Secretary commit to publishing the legislation she's referred to ahead of the summer recess?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, let me reassure Mr MacArthur and other chambers that I am absolutely committed to bringing forward the misogyny bill as soon as possible. It was a very important commitment within our programme for government that I'm sure members are well acquainted for. I am also extremely committed to working on a cross-party basis in the hope that moving forward in this substantial piece of legislation that will be coming forward that we can all at least attempt to move forward with some degree of unanimity, notwithstanding that we will of course want to vigorously debate and scrutinise to ensure that at the end of the day that we have the very best possible legislation to give further protection to women in this country.
Fulton McGregor, to be followed by Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For the most part, the Act is consolidating hate crime legislation into one single place. Is the actual effect then of the Act to properly recognise that crimes against public order, such as being threatening or abusive, which have long been in place, along with stirring up hatred against the community, is exactly that, a hate crime, and should be recognised as such?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, that is absolutely the case. The Hate Crime Act outlines that the offences covered in the legislation are hate crimes and are not acceptable. And there has been a lot of media coverage on the number of reports, understandably so, that have been received by Police Scotland, and the very fact that we have seen 213 police-recorded hate crimes last week and 232 the week before reinforces the importance of the Hate Crime Act. The Act is an essential element of our wider approach to tackling hate crime, as well as recognising the harm hate crime causes, and legislation sends an important message to victims, offenders and wider society that it should not and will not be tolerated.